Hello, my dear viewer. Welcome to this channel, where we explore the complexities of marital infidelity and its consequences when one partner begins to deceive the other. If, like me, you uphold strong family values and disapprove of cheating, then please subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. Let's dive in. The afternoon had a false sense of peace, a quiet stillness that wrapped the world in a deceptive calm. Jack was slumped on the couch, aimlessly flipping through the TV channels, his face blank, though inside his head, a storm of worries was raging. For months now, he had keenly noticed subtle shifts in his wife Sheila's behavior changes that unsettled him like an itch he couldn't reach. Sheila had begun leaving for work at the crack of dawn and returning late into the night. She was glued to her phone, her conversations filled with hushed tones and secretive smiles that she no longer tried to hide. When Jack confronted her, she brushed off his concerns with a dismissive wave, blaming her odd hours on work demands or social events, but Jack wasn't buying it. Something was undeniably wrong. Now, as he watched her pack in the bedroom for a trip she'd nervously talked about for weeks, an uneasy knot twisted in his stomach. The stillness of the house was heavy with unspoken tension. Jack listened to the faint rustling of clothes and the quiet zipping of bags, each sound intensifying his dread. His heart pounded faster, and finally unable to hold back any longer, he got up from the couch, leaning against the doorframe as he mustered the courage to ask the burning question that had plagued him. "Do you really need to go on this trip?" His voice wavered with anxiety, each word loaded with the fears he hadn't dared voice. For days this question had gnawed at him. He didn't want to seem paranoid, but the weight of doubt was becoming too much to bear. Without glancing up from her suitcase, Sheila continued folding clothes, as if the packing was more important than the conversation. "We've discussed this, Jack," she said evenly, her words sounding rehearsed. "I have to go for a while." "A whole week," he pressed, his voice tight with worry. "You've never taken a trip like this without me, and certainly not for so long." Finally, Sheila turned to face him, her expression cold and resolute. "Oh, Jack, I'm an independent woman. I don't need your permission to go out with my friends. I'm not your property." Her words hit him like a slap, a lump forming in his throat. He swallowed hard, resisting the urge to argue. "It wouldn't help, not now." "Fine," he muttered, stepping back, creating some distance between them. "Just be careful, okay?" Sheila rolled her eyes and resumed packing as though she could brush away the tension. Jack desperately wanted to convince himself that everything was fine, that his suspicions were just wild imaginings. But then something caught his eye in her suitcase. A cold wave of terror gripped his heart. Amid the pile of clothes, there was a scandalous police officer costume complete with a shiny badge, handcuffs, and a pointed hat. Not exactly what you'd expect for a regular girls' night out. "What the hell?" Sheila. Jack's voice broke through the air, thick with disbelief and anger. His heart raced as he stared at the outfit. "Why do you need this?" Momentarily startled, Sheila looked up, but her surprise quickly faded, replaced by a smug smile. "This," she said, holding up the costume with casual indifference, which only fueled Jack's rage. "It's just for fun. The girls and I are planning a little party tonight." At the sight of the outfit, a surge of heat shot through Jack's veins, his fists clenched tightly, his body trembling with a fury he hadn't known before. "I swear to God, Sheila, if you walk out that door in that thing," he growled, his voice low and threatening, "you'll regret it." Sheila laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down Jack's spine. "Shut up, Jack. Don't even try to control me. I told you I'm independent. I can do whatever I want." With a dramatic flourish, she reached into the closet and pulled out a large rubber band, waving it tauntingly in front of him, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "Oh, and by the way, my lover's already waiting for me outside." In that instant, Jack's world collapsed. Every doubt, every suspicion came crashing down like a tower of cards, and the weight of betrayal nearly crushed him. His hands trembled, not with fear but with tidal wave of rage. Without a word, he stormed out of the bedroom, his heart pounding like a drum. He raced downstairs, flinging the front door open so hard it slammed against the wall with a deafening bang. And there, leaning casually against a car with a cigarette hanging from his lips, was Sheila's lover, as if the world around him was of no consequence. "Hey," Jack snarled, fury seething through his voice as he charged across the lawn. Before the man could react, Jack grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward so violently that the cigarette flew from his mouth. "What's going on?" the man gasped, struggling against Jack's unyielding grip. But Jack didn't hear him. With fierce determination, he dragged the man inside, the door slamming shut with a dull thud. In a swift, brutal move, Jack threw the man onto the living room floor. Hearing the commotion, Sheila rushed downstairs, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Stop it, Jack! What are you doing?" she cried, her voice edged with desperation. But Jack was lost in a storm of rage, his mind consumed by betrayal. He didn't want Sheila to leave him, not for this man. He had reached a breaking point. Jack pinned the man down with a force that even surprised himself, the house echoing with the sounds of their struggle. Each blow he landed felt like an eruption of all the resentment and deceit that had built up inside him for months. The man beneath him gasped, struggling to defend himself, but Jack's anger was unrelenting, a storm that showed no sign of calming. Sheila's frantic screams filled the air as she desperately tried to pull Jack off her lover. Her voice was filled with panic and desperation as she clung to his shoulders, pleading frantically for help amidst the chaos. "Stop, Jack, please stop," she begged, her words full of fear. But with a furious growl, he shoved her aside, his eyes burning with uncontrollable rage. "Do you honestly think you can come into my house, sleep with my wife, and just walk away?" he spat, every word soaked in venom and betrayal. "Do you really believe I'll let you leave? I'll let you leave unharmed?" The man tried to speak, each breath turning into a desperate gasp. "Please, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Silence, Jack roared, his voice thundering through the room. His fist crashed into the man's jaw, snapping his head to the side. The fight drained from the intruder, leaving him lying limp on the floor. Sheila's screams pierced the tension, her voice a mix of panic and despair. "Jack, you're going to kill him." "Stop, please." For a moment, Jack hesitated, his chest heaving as he looked down at the man who had borne the brunt of his fury. Bloodied and broken, the man was a reminder of the depth of Jack's rage. Yet, even as he stared at the aftermath, there was no sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the revenge he had craved. It was a hollow shadow of the justice he had envisioned, one that failed to convey the full weight of his pain. His gaze shifted to Sheila, cold and unfeeling, devoid of any tenderness. "Sheila, do you think you're in control?" he asked in a low, menacing tone that made her shiver. Instinctively, Sheila recoiled, fear lighting up in her eyes as she tried to calm the situation. "Don't do something you'll regret. Let's just talk about this." Jack's lips twisted into a cruel smile void of any kindness. "Regret? I won't regret this, not for a second." Without warning, he grabbed her wrist, dragging her forcefully into the bedroom where her suitcase lay open on the bed. Silently, he pulled out the provocative police costume she had packed and shoved it into her trembling hands. "Put it on," he commanded, his tone icy. Sheila stared at him in disbelief, her voice quivering as she protested, "Have you lost your mind?" Jack's grip on her wrist tightened painfully, his eyes darkening with intensity. "Put it on, or Sheila, you will regret it." Tears streamed down Sheila's face as the horrifying reality set in. There was no escaping this nightmare. She had never imagined Jack could be so cruel, so merciless. Her hands shook as she began unbuttoning her blouse, her vision blurred by tears as she fumbled to put on the outfit. Every motion was weighted with fear and regret. With shaking hands, she fastened the belt, adjusted the hat, and finally turned to face Jack, her voice barely a whisper. "Jack, please listen to me," but his expression remained emotionless, watching her with chilling calm. Once she was dressed, he gestured towards the living room. "Go sit with your lover. Wait for the police." Sheila gasped, her eyes wide with horror. "The police? What are you talking about?" Jack offered no explanation. Instead, he picked up the phone, dialed emergency services, and spoke with a voice steady and almost cold. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance at my home. My wife and her lover are here. You'll want to see this." As soon as he hung up, the room was swallowed by a heavy silence. Desperation flickered in Sheila's eyes as she pleaded, "Don't do this, Jack, please. We can fix this. Just don't." But Jack had reached his breaking point. He was done with the lies, the emotional torment, and the endless betrayal. He walked past Sheila and the crumpled figure on the floor, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and relief as he approached the door. He firmly grasped the suitcase he had meticulously packed earlier. Pausing at the threshold, he turned slightly, his voice chilling. I'm taking everything, Sheila, the money, the house, the inheritance, everything down to the last cent." Her anguished sobs echoed through the room as she collapsed to the floor, burying her face in her hands in despair. Sheila had always believed she was in control, that her charm could bend Jack to her will, always forgiving her betrayals. But now, reality hit her like a crushing wave. She had lost it all, with no hope of return. As Jack stepped outside, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, the wailing becoming the backdrop to his newfound freedom. He didn't look back as he slid into his car, revved the engine, and roared off into the night. Darkness surrounded him, the road ahead stretching out into uncertainty. Yet, for the first time in months, a cold sense of satisfaction washed over him. He had finally taken control of his life. In that moment, Jack knew he had orchestrated a reckoning that Sheila and her lover would never forget. The absurd image of Sheila, dressed in that ridiculous costume, trying to explain herself to the police, brought a grim smile to his lips. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure Sheila's betrayal was etched into her memory forever. As the sound of the sirens faded into the distance, Jack pressed harder on the accelerator, leaving behind everyone and everything. He had no destination, and surprisingly, he didn't feel the need for one. The most important thing was the overwhelming sense of liberation that wrapped around him. He had severed himself from the web of deceit, freed himself from betrayal, and let go of a future he had once believed was his. He didn't slow down until he reached the airport, pulling into the vast parking lot and turning off the engine. Jack stepped out of the car, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the nearly empty space. Inside the airport, a different kind of energy buzzed, contrasting sharply with the turmoil he had just left behind. Yet he had no desire to linger on the past. He had a plan, and he intended to see it through without flaw. As he calmly approached the ticket counter, the vivid scenes of the last hour played through his mind: Sheila's tear-streaked face, her lover's muffled cries, and the clinical precision with which Jack had packed his suitcase one last time. Every memory stoked the fire of his resolve. When he finally reached the counter, he slid his passport across with unwavering determination. "One-way ticket," he said in a steady voice. To anywhere quiet, the agent paused briefly, perhaps sensing the tension in Jack's demeanor, but didn't question him. After typing a few keys, she handed him the ticket with an impassive expression. "Your flight departs in 30 minutes, she said. Jack nodded, taking the ticket, which felt both heavy and freeing in his hand. He had meticulously arranged everything, from transferring the funds to closing all accounts, ensuring there were no loose ends. He had been waiting for this day, and now that it had arrived, he was fully prepared. As he made his way to the security checkpoint, an unexpected sense of peace settled over him. His old life was fading away, but instead of feeling anxious, he found comfort in the realization. He moved through security without a hitch and headed toward his gate. The waiting area was almost empty, with only a few tired individuals scattered among the rows of plastic chairs. Sitting by the window, Jack gazed out at the distant runway, watching as the city lights flickered and gradually disappeared into the approaching night. Rather than feeling burdened by the weight of his decisions, he was overcome with a thrilling sense of finality. This chapter of his life had come to a close, leaving him with the enticing possibility of a fresh start. His marriage, once the foundation of his world, lay in ruins, wrecked by betrayal. Yet from that emotional wreckage, Jack had discovered something new, an opportunity to begin again. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Jack joined the line, his thoughts drifting back to those last moments at home. He had walked away without a backward glance, leaving Sheila to face the consequences of his choices. She had always believed she held the reins of her own fate, but ultimately it had been Jack who had controlled everything. Once seated on the plane, he looked out the window as the city shrank beneath him, its lights twinkling like distant stars fading into the embrace of night. He knew that consequences were inevitable, questions, perhaps even investigations, but those concerns belonged to a different time, a different life. Right now he reveled in the exhilarating sense of freedom. As the plane ascended, Jack's thoughts unraveled, drifting away from the shadows of his past. The future stretched out before him like a blank canvas, waiting for bold strokes in a place where no one knew him, which was exactly what he desired. The turbulence of his old life was behind him, and ahead lay the promise of something new. As he soared toward the horizon, a wave of relief washed over him. The island welcomed Jack like a dream, its warm embrace a stark contrast to the cold, calculated life he had left behind. The villa he had rented wasn't lavish, but it was perfectly situated on a serene beach, where soft white sand met turquoise waves, far from the chaos and betrayal that had haunted him. Jack embarked on the difficult journey of rebuilding his life. In the mornings he awoke to the gentle lullaby of the ocean, its sound a soothing balm for his soul, gradually washing away the lingering anger that had once consumed him. The days passed in simple routines, a cherished ritual that kept his mind from wandering back into the darkness of the past. Every day he swam in the crystal-clear waters, and with each stroke he felt himself distancing from his old self. The ocean became his confessional, a sacred space where he could release his burdens. While it didn't fully cleanse him, it made him feel lighter. After lunch, Jack would wander around the island, seeking out hidden trails that wound through lush tropical forests. He met the locals, warm-hearted people who had lived on the island all their lives. They greeted him with open arms, offering a genuine warmth he hadn't felt in years. No one pried into his past or bombarded him with questions he wasn't ready to answer. They simply let him be, exchanging friendly waves and sharing simple meals. In their company, Jack found a deep sense of peace. As dusk fell, he would sit on the porch of his villa, book in hand and a glass of rum by his side. The sunsets were breathtaking, the sky ablaze with vivid hues as the sun dipped below the horizon. In those moments, Jack allowed himself to reflect on the beauty of the present and the promise of what was yet to come. However, the haunting memories of his past clung to Jack like a shadow, always lurking beneath the surface of his tranquil new life. During peaceful moments, it felt as if those dark days belonged to someone else, a distant echo of a life he was desperate to leave behind. But the past had a way of creeping back into his thoughts, waiting to strike when he least expected it. On quiet nights, when the world outside had fallen silent and only the gentle rhythm of the waves kissed the shore, Jack would lie awake, staring at the ceiling as memories crashed over him, stealing his breath. He could still see Sheila's tear-streaked face, hear her lover's anguished cries, and recall the chilling satisfaction he had felt in watching their misery. That satisfaction now sent shivers through him, a ghost of a feeling he could barely tolerate. Though the sharp sting of guilt had dulled over time, it lingered, always present, waking him in the night. Seeing couples walking hand in hand along the beach often stirred this guilt, their laughter ringing out like a bell in the stillness. It reminded him of what he had lost, more accurately, what he had destroyed. Once he and Sheila had walked those same sandy paths, their hearts full of love and laughter, untouched by betrayal. Now, those memories sliced through him, leaving an ache in his heart that refused to disappear. Music, too, had become a merciless trigger, a siren's call pulling him back to the past he so desperately wanted to forget. Every melody seemed to echo with cruel nostalgia, reminding him of the joy that had slipped through his fingers like sand. The memories overwhelmed Jack when a familiar song played on the radio. Tender moments of dancing with Sheila, her laughter breaking through the music like sunlight through the trees, filled his mind. For a fleeting moment he could almost feel her presence, her head resting on his shoulder, their world brimming with happiness. But just as quickly, that warmth was snatched away, replaced by a sharp, searing pain that dragged him back into the grip of regret. Life on the island was like living in paradise, where the waves whispered secrets and the sunsets painted the sky in gold. Yet, at the same time, the island served as a constant reminder of his self-imposed exile. It was both a sanctuary and a prison, a beautiful escape that offered comfort, but tethered him to his past. Still, Jack knew he couldn't remain hidden forever, haunted by the ghosts of what had once been. The tranquility of the island was a fleeting distraction, not the solution he desperately sought. He needed to find a way out, a path to overcome the darkness that followed him like a shadow. After spending a year in isolation, he made a pivotal decision. It was time to go back home. This choice was laden with uncertainty, and the thought of leaving the sanctuary of the island filled him with dread. Yet deep inside, he understood the importance of this journey. He could no longer hide to truly begin anew. He had to face his past and come to terms with the choices that had brought him to this point. Only then could he hope to find the peace he desperately sought. As he packed his things, he took one last look at the villa, the inviting beach, and the endless ocean that had provided him refuge. A bittersweet feeling hung in the air, tinged with the promise of upcoming challenges and renewal. In the island's tranquil embrace, he had found the space to heal, but now it was time to venture into the unknown. Standing at the water's edge, his mind swirled with doubt, yet one truth was undeniable: he could no longer run from the shadows of his past. The moment had come to face the ghosts that had haunted him for too long. Returning home felt like stepping into a surreal dream, a mix of nostalgia and disconnection. Life bustled around him, the familiar sounds wrapping around him like an old, forgotten song. Yet everything seemed subtly altered, as if he were a ghost drifting through a world that had moved on without him. It felt as if he had vanished, leaving behind only confusion and unanswered questions. But the relentless passage of time had dulled the memories of those he once knew, burying them beneath new scandals and fresh stories. Jack was no longer the same man who had fled. He had left that version of himself behind, buried under the sands of the island. To blend into this new reality unnoticed, he adopted a fresh identity in a quiet part of the city. He rented a modest apartment, choosing a fake name and paying in cash, vanishing into the background. The life he once cherished had become a distant memory, replaced by the armor of anonymity he now wore. Something, however, pulled Jack back to the city he thought he had left behind for good. Perhaps it was a need to close the door on his past, or maybe an unconscious urge to confront the consequences of his actions. The journey began in the familiar surroundings of his old neighborhood. As he drove past the house that had once been his sanctuary, a wave of nostalgia hit him. Once lively and full of energy, the home now stood neglected, a shadow of what it had once been. The lawn was overgrown, the shutters hung crooked and worn, and the faded for sale signs swayed mournfully in the breeze. A sharp pang of regret struck him as he looked at it, but he quickly pushed it aside. That chapter was closed, and holding on to the past was pointless. On nights when Jack couldn't quiet his mind, he drove through the city, reliving every stage of his life with Sheila in his head. The memories came flooding back as he passed the cafe where they had shared their first date, the park where they had enjoyed lazy picnics, and the hotel that had been the setting for their honeymoon. Each place stirred a rush of emotions, some sweet and tender, others bitter and haunting. Yet over every cherished memory hung the heavy shadow of how it all fell apart. In the end, he found himself in a small, unremarkable bar on the outskirts of the city, a place he had frequented in his younger days. The lighting was dim, and the atmosphere was quiet, with just a few patrons nursing their drinks. It felt oddly familiar, like an old friend waiting to share forgotten stories. Jack took a seat at the bar and ordered a whiskey, the amber liquid glowing in the dim light. He cradled the glass in his hands, letting its warmth seep into him as he drifted into a haze of memories that sent chills down his spine. Each sip brought momentary comfort, but it couldn't silence the ghosts of his past. Just as he was sinking into his thoughts, a sudden tap on his shoulder pulled him back to reality. Turning, he found himself face to face with Clark, an old acquaintance, standing there with a mix of disbelief and excitement. "Jack, is it really you?" Clark's voice carried a nostalgia that tugged at Jack's heart. Forcing a smile, Jack nodded. "Yeah, it's me." Clark's eyes widened in surprise. "It's been so long," he exclaimed, pulling up a stool. His gaze lingered on Jack's face, a hint of concern in his expression. "You look different," he added quietly. Jack chuckled, but the laugh was dry, concealing deeper truths. "What can I say?" Life happened. The two men fell into an easy rhythm, reminiscing about their wild adventures, the hours slipping by unnoticed. Laughter bridged the years that had passed, but beneath the light-hearted banter, Jack sensed the weight of unspoken questions lingering in the air. Questions like smoke drifting from a fire. Where had he gone? What had happened to his marriage? Why had he disappeared so suddenly? As the evening progressed, the mood shifted from playful to more serious. Clark leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the shadows around them might hear. "Jack, there's something you need to know. Things fell apart after you left." A tight knot formed in Jack's chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, a sense of foreboding creeping into his thoughts. Clark hesitated, choosing his words carefully as if they carried immense weight. "It's Sheila. She's really been struggling. After you disappeared, she fell apart completely." The impact of Clark's revelation hit Jack hard. The police got involved. There was an investigation, but it didn't lead anywhere. She lost everything: her home, her job. She's living with her sister now, trying to piece her life back together. A storm of emotions raged inside Jack: dread, guilt, and an unsettling sense of satisfaction. He had wanted Sheila to feel the sting of betrayal, to suffer in his absence. Yet hearing about her downfall, Jack found himself reconsidering. This wasn't the distant revenge he had imagined. This was real, a woman's life torn apart, irreparably damaged. Her once luxurious life now felt like a distant memory. Did it ever occur to you to reach out to her, maybe even make amends? After all, you two were married for 42 years. Clark asked cautiously, his tone tentative as though stepping on fragile ground. Jack stared into his whiskey, mesmerized by the way the amber liquid swirled. The thought of facing Sheila, of confronting the wreckage they had both left behind, sent a chill through him. "I don't know, Clark. I'm not sure I can do it." Understanding flickered in Clark's eyes as the silence between them deepened. "It's a tough road," Buddy Clark said softly. "Maybe it's time for both of you to start living again." Jack remained quiet, knowing deep down that his friend was right, yet the path to reconciliation loomed before him like a dark, twisting maze, daunting and full of uncertainty. As he drained his glass, the weight of reality settled heavily on his shoulders. He realized he needed to face not only his past, but also the question of what kind of future he truly wanted. Jack was perhaps on the brink of making the hardest decision of his life. Despite the doubts that gnawed at him, a few days later, he found himself standing outside Sheila's sister's house, a mix of anxiety and determination swirling inside him. Every time he had passed this house before, he had made up endless excuses, postponing the inevitable confrontation that had been gnawing at him for so long. But today was different. He knew he couldn't hide anymore. He needed answers, closure, something to help untangle the complex emotions that had become his constant companion. With a slightly trembling hand, he knocked on the door. The seconds stretched on, each one making his heart pound harder. Then, as if moved by an invisible force, the door slowly creaked open, revealing Sheila. She looked different, a far cry from the vibrant woman he once knew. Time had left its mark on her, etching lines of weariness across her face where once there had been confidence. For a long, tense moment they simply stood there, staring at each other, unable to speak, both trapped in the heavy silence of unspoken truths. Finally, Sheila's voice broke through the stillness, soft and unsure. "Hello," she said, a trace of reluctance in her tone. "Hi," Jack replied, his voice rough and thick with unprocessed emotions. Seeing his struggle, she stepped aside, a silent invitation for him to come in. The interior of the house was modest, far removed from the warmth and elegance they had once shared, yet it had a comforting familiarity that wrapped around him like an old blanket. They moved into the living room, sitting at opposite ends of the sofa, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Sheila finally said, her voice shaky as she met his eyes. There was a flicker of both fear and hope in her gaze, like a candle struggling to stay lit in the darkness. In her, Jack saw a vulnerability he had never noticed before. "I wasn't sure I would come back," Jack admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I needed to see you. I needed to understand why you did what you did." Sheila dropped her gaze, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap, betraying her inner turmoil. "I don't have a good answer, Jack," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I was selfish. I wanted more than what I had, and I didn't appreciate what we had built together. I thought I was in control, but I was only fooling myself. I made horrible mistakes, and I destroyed everything." The anger that had tormented Jack for so long began to fade, replaced by a deep sadness that settled in his chest. "I know I wasn't perfect either, Sheila. I have my own regrets, but what you did, it broke me." Tears welled up in Sheila's eyes, glistening like dew, but she quickly wiped them away, struggling to hold herself together. The weight of their shared past hung in the room, a bittersweet reminder of what they had lost and what might still be salvaged. "Jack, I'm so sorry. If I could turn back time, I'd do anything to erase the pain I caused you." Her words were sincere, yet the silence that followed was thick with emotions neither of them could fully express. They sat quietly, lost in the echoes of their shared history, as the room seemed to absorb the heavy burden of memories woven from love and betrayal. Eventually Sheila spoke again, her voice a fragile whisper. "What do we do now? Do we just go our separate ways?" Jack sighed deeply, sinking further into the worn cushions of the sofa. "I came here looking for closure, but now I'm realizing it's not that simple. So much has happened, too much has been broken. Sheila met his words with a steady gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of empathy and regret. I understand, Jack. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know how deeply sorry I am. The silence between them was different now, no longer suffocating, but still palpable. For the first time in years, Jack felt a tiny crack in the fortress of pain and anger that had surrounded him since that fateful day. It was fragile, but it hinted at something more, an opening, a possibility. I need time, he said finally, his voice steady but vulnerable. We may never be what we were, but maybe we can find a way to move forward, even if it's separately. A bittersweet smile tugged at Sheila's lips, and a glimmer of hope shone in her eyes. Tears shimmered, though they didn't fall, reflecting the emotional storm within her. I'd like that, Jack, I really would. They remained in their places, both reluctant to say goodbye, but fully aware that this conversation had been a crucial step toward whatever lay ahead. For the first time since their world fell apart, Jack felt a small spark of hope ignite within him. Maybe, with time, they could both find some sense of peace. In the days that followed their emotional confrontation, Jack and Sheila began the tentative journey toward healing. Their interactions were cautious, marked by tentative steps forward. They weren't trying to rebuild what had been lost, but instead learning how to live with the scars that remained. Initially, their communication was fraught with tension, each word and glance heavy with the weight of their history. They navigated around each other, unsure how to engage, fearful of saying too much or too little. Still, the desire for some form of resolution kept them connected, even amidst the discomfort. One afternoon, they found themselves sitting on an old bench in a quiet park, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was their first walk in weeks, a much-needed break from the confines of Sheila's sister's home. The air was thick with nostalgia and unspoken anticipation. Jack spoke first, his voice carrying a blend of determination and reflection. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, Sheila. What happened, it's impossible to forget. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Sheila lowered her eyes, tracing patterns on the ground with her gaze. I understand, Jack, she whispered. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to see that I'm trying to make amends, even if I can't change the past. A heavy silence followed as they both became lost in thought. The past year had been tumultuous for them both, and the road to healing seemed long and uncertain. But beneath the weight of their shared past, there was an unspoken understanding they needed to find a way forward, even if it meant walking different paths. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent, sometimes over coffee, sometimes during walks in the park. Slowly, their conversations shifted. Instead of focusing on the pain, they began to discuss lighter, everyday topics. Sheila opened up about her struggles with adjusting to a new job and her progress in therapy, while Jack spoke about his aspirations for the future. These exchanges, though not deep, were a significant step toward regaining a sense of normalcy. Gradually, a new kind of relationship began to take shape between them. Neither of them had foreseen this outcome, but it held the promise of healing and understanding. Over time, Jack noticed that the intense anger that had once consumed him was beginning to fade. He came to understand that holding onto those bitter emotions only kept him tied to a painful past, preventing him from focusing on the future. One calm evening, as he sat on the porch of his comfortable new home, watching a stunning sunset, he felt a long-lost sensation, peace. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but rather a quiet acceptance that some things couldn't be fixed, and that was all right. He had confronted his inner demons, made peace with the past, and now it was time to move forward with his life. Free from the darkness that had once clouded his thoughts, Jack felt lighter and more optimistic. Meanwhile, Sheila had embarked on her own path toward recovery. Therapy sessions helped her untangle the complexities of her past, and her new job provided the stability she had been seeking. Though she knew she could never completely undo the harm she had caused, she was determined to learn from her mistakes and become a better version of herself. Their relationship, though changed and redefined, was no longer what it had been. It had evolved into something different, something meaningful and full of promise. They were no longer friends in the traditional sense, but a deep, unspoken connection tied them together. Both had weathered their own storms, coming out not entirely whole but undoubtedly transformed. They had uncovered strengths they hadn't known they possessed, shedding the titles of husband and wife while leaving behind the resentment that had once shaped their interactions. Now, they were simply two people who had faced their challenges and were beginning to walk their own separate paths in life. And so the days passed. It wasn't meant to be a fairy tale, nor did it need to be. It was a new beginning, a beginning that felt right. Jack had finally let go of the bitterness that had once clung to him like a shadow. In doing so, he found the peace he had long sought. Standing at the edge of twilight, watching the sun bathe the sky in hues of orange and purple, he realized that he was ready to embrace whatever the future had in store for him. And that, my friend, is the end of the story. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the Force be with you.